Thanks very much. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
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 Working. There's a bit of housekeeping that we do before we start these sessions, and I've now been effectively the panel coordinator. Lyndall Ryan's brainchild was what this panel was going to be, and Lyndall can't be with us, so forgive her for not being here and tolerate me. We're beginning with an acknowledgement of country, Gadigal country, Eora people, this part of the world. I've come up the highway, which was a highway that was probably long known and well walked by Aboriginal people over thousands of years, and I come from Taungurung country and Yorta Yorta country, so I bring you greetings from that part of the world. I live in a small country town called Euroa. In acknowledging the people whose country this is, we want to acknowledge their resourcefulness, their resilience and their determination. If you need to look for examples of that, in very recent times, you'll find Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory in the High Court demanding their rights about housing. You'll find Aboriginal people in Western Australia demanding their rights about native title in the Wongai claim. Both of those particular pieces of litigation took decades and generations of Aboriginal people's determination. You'll also find Aboriginal people in Western Australia engaged in getting their wages back off the Western Australian government, and we're talking about $200 million, which is probably nowhere near enough, and many of the people whose wages were stolen between 1936 and 1972 have passed away and will never see the money that they should have received for their labour. For those of you here in New South Wales, you've probably also followed the case of Latrell Mitchell, and you will have watched the ACT police being told that their inability to recall what occurred outside a nightclub is inexplicable, and we might all ask, well, what's going to happen next? Here today, you're going to hear from all four of us in various ways. You'll hear from Stephen Gapps. Stephen's an historian and author. He's a museum curator, and I'm going to call him a public intellectual. I think he likes that title. He's written on the Sydney Wars and also, more recently, also on Aboriginal people's struggle for country and for survival. You'll hear too from David Marr, whose very recent book, Killing for Country, has just been published by Black Ink. Thank you, David. And you'll hear from Tony Birch, and Tony, of course, is an award-winning author, and I did invite Tony to be a roving commentator here for this particular forum, but we've decided not to do that. Tony's most recent book is going to be the subject of some discussion in this festival shortly, in one of the next sessions. It's the book on women and children, but that's not what he'll talk about here today. Tony, of course, holds an Australian Literature Chair with the University of Melbourne. Is that still the case, Tony?
It is still the case. Yeah, I'm cashed up, so if anyone needs a loan.
And I'll talk about a book that I also published with Black Ink on O'Leary, and we'll come to that shortly. What we thought we'd do is that we would give each of the authors upwards of 10 minutes, and then we would really literally invite you to be part of a conversation. And for that, we're very pleased that you're all sitting towards the front. Notwithstanding that most Australians don't like sitting in the front row, it appears that the front row is well populated, which is good to see. Let's begin with you, Stephen. Let's begin with why you wrote what you wrote about the wars and why you're here at a Crime Writers Festival talking about war and massacres.
Firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners where we are today, the unceded Bamal and Badu, land and waters, the Sydney region. Where do I begin? I do have some talking points.
While he's finding them, he's recovering from COVID and told us to be gentle with him, so please keep that in mind.
I did want to apologise. I'm not positive anymore, but I still feel like I've got COVID, so I'm sorry about that. And this husky voice is not normal. Now, firstly, can I sort of dodge that question for a second?
Please do.
I did want to start with the description of today's talk, which mentions, take a little umbrage at it, sorry, but it mentions that that historians, the suggestion that historians are only recently looking at frontier wars, histories and massacres. And I'd like to just acknowledge the historians from the 1970s onwards, such as Henry Reynolds, Lyndall Ryan, that have been working on this tirelessly for decades. But having said that, I think it's a really good point that people like me, historians like me, what I did was when Henry Reynolds said 20 years ago or more, we've looked at the big picture of the frontier wars. What we need now is to do the forensic local histories of those wars and conflicts. And that's, I think, the process that I'm involved in, and that sparked me to actually start writing about the Sydney Wars. The Sydney Wars, to me, was like the elephant in the room. I had no idea that there was a coherent kind of topic about warfare in Sydney, but when I started to pull together the threads of what happened in the early colony up to 1816, it was obvious to me that historians had missed the militarisation of the colony and the effective invasion of the Sydney Basin that took until 1816, until Governor Macquarie basically sent out military detachments to secure the basin from resistance warfare forevermore. And so I guess when I wrote the Sydney Wars, I was like, oh, surely there's been thousands and thousands of pages written on early colonial Sydney. Am I making this up? No, it turns out the reception was quite good. And it inspired me to carry on and to write about the next step, I guess, in the Sydney Wars, which was the Bathurst War. Now, there was a connection for me. Writing the Sydney Wars in 1816 was like, what was Governor Macquarie doing, trying to secure the Sydney Basin? Really, in effect, I could see the connection with Bathurst. The Bathurst Plains had been, invaded from 1813 onwards, and Macquarie had set up Bathurst. One of the first things he did with the 1816 campaigns that ended in the Appin Massacre of April 1816 was to secure the road across the Blue Mountains and establish garrisons right across the Blue Mountains, because Bathurst was the future of the colony, and Macquarie knew that. Of course, the next phase is resistance west of the Blue Mountains, and in next year is the 200th anniversary of the declaration of martial law west of the Blue Mountains, a significant event. And so that inspired me to write about the Bathurst War. Currently, I've been working on kind of the next phase of resistance warfare, which is around 1838 to 1840. And from my work, I've been coming across a lot of contemporary observations that in around 1838, right across the entire frontier, and that's quotes, several observers quote that, there was wars going on. So this next project, I'm looking at a series of wars from Benalla to Brisbane that occur around this period. Mile Creek, you've probably heard of, is just part of that situation. That is a colonial crisis at this point. And as Kate was saying, she drove up on the Hume, what we used to call the Hume Highway. One of the important things I'm coming across with this period was that the first establishments of several local towns along that route that we go Sydney to Melbourne every day, Benalla, Violet Town, Albury, Gundagai, were all established as military outposts. When the battle at Broken River, which I'm looking at now, which is Benalla, occurred and 8 white people died, that was a crisis for Governor Gapps, and the Port Phillip Road, the road between Sydney and the new aspiring colony, it wasn't a colony yet, it was all New South Wales, was under threat. That road was seriously under threat And of course he had to send the military and establish military outposts. And so a lot of those local towns, I'm fascinated by these local histories that begin with the pioneers. They actually begin with military outposts against the resistance warfare that was going on. I've probably done my dash, but
No, you haven't. No, you haven't.
I have-
Now, massacres are massacres, and people think it's history. We're here today to talk crime, and your work really does take us into what was criminal about what was going on. Perhaps you could explore that before we leap to David.
yeah, just briefly, I did want to say that I guess what I'm getting at too is that we have focused a lot on massacres. I believe we haven't focused enough on what comes before the massacres. Often is the resistance warfare and the strength that we can draw and that Aboriginal people can draw from the threat that resistance warfare took. Often these massacres occur after strong resistance by Aboriginal warriors. So I think, and one of my complaints about some historians is that they call battles massacres. I've looked at like lists of massacres in Australia, and some of those were Aboriginal victories. They weren't massacres at all. So I think we do need to sort out the connection between resistance warfare and massacres. Sometimes battles end up in massacres. Sometimes they're Aboriginal victories, and we tend to ignore those. Rightly so, we're focusing on massacres, and they're incredibly important. In what I said in my social media about this event was, I'm really glad that a Crime Writers Festival is looking at arguably the most serious crimes committed in Australian history. The most serious series of crimes committed in Australian history were the massacres of the Frontier Wars. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. And there's a link which is a nice segue to you, David, because in fact when you talk about the Bathurst Declaration of Martial Law in 1824, and you know that the military was sent out, and generally speaking you would see a report compiled by the military as to what occurred. There's never been found the report about what happened during that declaration of martial law. We do not know how many people were murdered. We do not know whether women and children were amongst them, and they would have been, and that document just does not exist or has not been found. Which brings us to you, David, because the Queensland Native Police also seems to have a lot of missing bureaucratic documents.
When you say a lot, you mean all?
I do.
Yes. It was a... Look, I'll get there. I'm going to take my own path there. Firstly by saying, I don't read enough crime, so therefore I may say things about the genre that are simply untrue. And if you sense this at all, just stand in your seat and say, shut up, or you've got it wrong. But I've always loved writing about crime, particularly from the time when I was a child, perhaps only 5 years old, when I joined the National Times staff. And we loved crime at the National Times. We loved reporting the crime of mighty people. So we loved writing about tax evasion. We loved writing about, and to the distress of many of us, we loved writing about the criminal activities of Lionel Bloody Murphy. And we followed crime. And I was thinking the other day that my book, Killing for Country, is actually the longest National Times article I've ever read, I've ever written. It's only about 400 pages. But one of the things I discovered in tracking my family's horrible record on the frontier, as my great-great-grandfather was an officer in the Native Police, his brother was as well, and various other members of the family were land takers, politicians, etc., etc., etc. So it's a sort of a one-family compendium history of land taking and killing. But as I spent 4 or 5 years researching this, one of the conclusions I came to was that the colony, which was essentially Sydney, it was just a nest of criminals. They were all crooks. They were shysters, forgers, thieves, claim jumpers, the lot. I mean, one member of my family is a very, very rich man in Sydney. He was the president of the Bank of New South Wales. He was a leading Christian and a man of extraordinary benevolence, only to white people, of course. But when his time came in the great economic mill and he went bankrupt, he bilked his creditors by hiding his main asset, his sheep, in the names of his family. He was a crook. His creditors got 6 shillings in the pound, and he re-emerged from bankruptcy with 186,000 acres in the hinterland of Maryborough. He didn't like living in the bush, so he went down to Brisbane, bought 90 acres along the Brisbane River and built a bungalow there, and he called that New Farm. And so they're all criminals, and the context of what happened in the bush can't really be separated from the context of what was happening in town, which was crime. Colonisation was essentially crime in nearly all of its aspects. And while there was this thing called British law, which was supposed to guard black and white alike, honestly, the rhetoric of those claims about the beauty of British law in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s is so beautiful. You don't even need to set them to music. They sing from the page, and they were bullshit. They were just bullshit. My understanding of the genre of crime is that it mainly focuses on identifying the criminal, and then you kind of assume that justice will follow. Now, look, I might be infantilizing the whole genre by saying that, but in the colony, the identity of the criminal was often very widely known. The problem was to make any repercussions follow and to actually engage the law. Queensland made a 5-decade habit of turning a blind eye to all of the crimes that were committed on the frontier, including not just killing, the theft of women, but kidnapping. Kidnapping was a big element of the frontier wars and a constant provocation to violence. After massacres, or even without massacres, the native police kidnapped children, girls to be put into domestic service, and worse, boys to be either personal servants. My boy, in Queensland, all colonial figures had a boy, and God knows what was happening to that child, but they were slaves. And this was against the law, and Queensland never prosecuted a single example of kidnapping in the entire 19th century, never. But the main crime, of course, was the crime of murder. And for those people who claim that people were different then, or things were different then, and you've got to understand, you can't apply 21st century views to what's happening in the 19th century. Just go to the definitions of murder in Queensland in 1850 and in Queensland today, virtually identical words. But the problem always was the problem of witnesses. And one of the ways that no repercussions followed, let's go through the order. The number of ways that no repercussions followed. The silence of the bush, I call it. An omerta that was imposed in the bush against anybody who dobbed. Then there was the problem that until 1876 in Queensland and in New South Wales, Aboriginal people could not give evidence in court. Now, you will understand this, won't you? Because Christians never lie in court because they understand that a lake of burning pitch awaits them for eternity in hell should they lie to the magistrate. Aborigines did not understand that, and therefore their word could not be trusted in court. That meant no survivors of massacres could ever give evidence against the perpetrators of the massacres. And what's more, no native troopers, the native police were white officers and Aboriginal troopers, no native troopers could give evidence against their superior officers. So the courts were closed to Aboriginal people. The silence of the bush made it extremely difficult to actually muster witnesses. And that is why, in my book, one of my heroes in my book is Lancelot Threlkeld, who is somebody who crops up here, there, everywhere. There were almost no missionaries in New South Wales in the 20s and 30s, because the Aborigines had nothing to sell. Missionaries went where they could trade, and that meant out in the Pacific and Aotearoa and New Zealand. But at sort of near the mouth of the Hunter Valley in Awabakal, is that the correct pronunciation? Yeah, Awabakal country. There was this splendid man, Lancelot Threlkeld, and unlike every other clerical figure in New South Wales, he was not on the government payroll. He was a working man who had gone into the church. He had been sent out with the delicious task of translating the Gospels into the language of the native peoples. It's a pity he chose Awabakal because it is spoken by very, very few people. But anyway, he was there working on the Gospel of St. Luke, and he had as his helper a man called Biraban, who had been taken as a child to be a servant of a military man in Sydney and had returned to his people. He spoke perfect English. And Biraban was also Threlkeld's eyes and ears in the Hunter Valley. And through his servants and through the people who liked Threlkeld, the Aboriginal people liked Threlkeld, through them he heard about the killings in the Hunter Valley. Killings carried out not just by settlers, some of those settlers being actually magistrates, but also by the military in the Hunter Valley. And why I love Threlkeld is that he got word of what had happened, and then he went and investigated the crimes himself. He interviewed people, he talked to people, he confirmed what had happened, and then he wrote beautifully clear and detailed letters to the Attorney General. And through that method, he also persuaded people to give evidence, to actually come to court and give evidence. And through his work, a remarkable thing happened. A Lieutenant Lowe, who, amongst other killings, had ordered his men to take a prisoner, an Indigenous prisoner, from his cell early one morning and simply shoot him. Lowe was charged with murder. But he was defended by that great man of liberty and principle in the colonies, Wentworth, plus an ex-barrister from London called Waddell, who was the editor of Wentworth's hideous newspaper, The Australian. The witnesses were convicts. Juries in those days were made up of military officers, and Lowe was acquitted within minutes. But here was a man who believed in justice, who did what justice required. He found the facts, he found the witnesses, and the system still did not offer justice. And that became the Lowe case, in many ways as much as the Mile Creek case, where the system did work for once. They became a signal that resounded for the rest of the century, which was that military and police officers could get away with anything they wanted to do. And it was a failure of the law following crime. So I'm very interested in viewing the violence of the frontier. I agree it's war. It was war of a very particular kind, but it was also crime. And the failure of enforcement was a direct cause of hideous death and violence.
Thanks, David. Tony, you didn't want to do roving, but do you want to comment on either of the observations we've heard before I say something?
Yes. I mean, just one thing that David mentioned that I just want to, as an aside, well, not an aside, that point about Aboriginal people not being able to give evidence in court, there's such a perverse absence of justice there, so that people may or may not know that the first men hung in the colony of Port Phillip, and the only public hanging ever was of two Aboriginal men from Tasmania who had been in a party with Trukanini, who had come across to Victoria. they could not give evidence in court, but they could be tried in court. So they were hung for murder and weren't even able to speak in their own defence. So this is how terrible it was. I suppose in regard to both conversations, I've been thinking about, I'm really interested in a sort of what I would call a slippage, so that just to tell a little story and backtrack to these issues, that in the early 90s there was a Victorian Tourism Board project to re-establish Indigenous names in what was then called the Grampians National Park. The new name was to be called the Grampians National Park, and what was agreed is that many sites in the park would become dual named and some particularly offensive names would be changed, so like Lubberus Creek, etc. So there's some quite offensive terms. So I was a young, no, not that young, I wasn't young at all. I was a youngish postgrad at the time, and there was a huge backlash against this quite minor project from people in the Western District of Victoria, and quite a lot of racial vilification, which was unexpected in some ways because there'd been relatively good relations in a lot of those country towns like Stawell and Horsham and Ararat between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. The main argument against the name restoration was one, either that it was a landscape of terra nullius, that there hadn't been Aboriginal people in this area because they regarded it as a spiritual place of such significance they were afraid of it, which is ludicrous. And certainly the other one was that the deaths of Aboriginal people or the removal of Aboriginal people in that area had not occurred as a result of war, massacre or any form of criminal violence. And that was a really strong established narrative, that the pioneer story of that area was one of benign settlement. So I was working on that project, and what I decided to do was to go and look at primary sources. And there were people commenting at the time, well, if these crimes had occurred, that silence of the bush is a lovely term of David's, they are unknown to us. So there was a sort of contemporary idea that either they hadn't occurred, or if they had occurred, we don't know anything about them. So I went and looked at three major primary sources. So I looked at George Augustus Robinson's published diaries when he had become the Chief Protector of Aborigines in Victoria after he left Van Diemen's Land. I looked at the Sir Thomas Mitchell, Major Mitchell diaries of his expedition into what was called Australia Felix. And I looked at the diaries of a man called George Tice Gellibrand, who had been the Surveyor General in Tasmania, who then became the person who designed the fake treaties for John Batman. So he had been a lawyer. And what I came across very quickly was that in these primary sources produced between about 1836 with Mitchell's expedition into the early 1840s, that extensively in all of these publications were widespread reporting of violence. So when Robinson was made Chief Protector in Victoria, the first trip he took was he went up through central Victoria, went across towards Garrywood, and then came down to Portland and back along the coast to what we know as Melbourne. And he repeatedly comes across evidence of murder and massacre, not only hearsay evidence, so that in Portland he speaks to the Chief Constable, a man called Blair, who reports that the Aboriginal people are being indiscriminately killed. And even for Robinson, who's such a problematic figure, he writes at the end of that first tour, he is so much in despair himself. He said, this behaviour would never be allowed in a civilised society. And that does include first-hand reports of the murder of women and children. In Mitchell's diary, there is a massacre of 8 men at what we know today as the Murray River. And what's so shocking about that is that Mitchell is reporting these entries immediately that he returns to the colony in New South Wales, so it's not a buried diary. And when you read Mitchell's diary, what you witness is a man who is becoming very anxious about the presence of Aboriginal people on their own country. They don't engage him in any hostile way. They track him across Wiradjuri country to see what he's doing. And you can see in the diary entries he becomes increasingly, I would say, paranoid about this. So he lays what he calls himself an ambuscade, is the term he uses, and him and his party cross the river. When the 8 Aboriginal men enter the river, they kill them. Now, he got a knighthood after that tour. He has a parrot named after him. My friend Gary Foley said we should kidnap the parrot and torture it, but anyway. So there's no consequences for that. And then you go to Joseph Tice Gellibrand, who comes to the Port Phillip settlement with John Batman. He has the treaty documents and he stays there. And just after they arrive, they come across William Buckley, who's the white man who had lived with Aboriginal people for 32 years. Buckley is made an assistant to Gellibrand, and Gellibrand thinks that he will act as a translator or interpreter between him and mainly Wathaurong people, which is in the Geelong area west of Melbourne. And if you read Gellibrand's diaries, again, when he's going down towards the Barwon River, the reports, particularly of rape in this case of women, is widespread. And there's a remarkable exchange where an Aboriginal woman seeing Buckley, and he's been part of the Wathaurong Nation for 32 years, rather than expect Buckley to act on behalf of Gellibrand, she expects Buckley to act on behalf of his Aboriginal people. And she says to Buckley, I want justice for what has occurred. She wants justice for this rape and expects him to act on her behalf. So what I was interested in is that there isn't this great silence at the time. There is this incredible widespread knowledge of the death of Aboriginal people and a widespread acceptance of that death, notwithstanding that there are good people, as David just alluded to, is that the Anti-Slavery Society at the time in London are campaigning to the House of Commons to stop the violence that is occurring in the colonies. And it is one of the reasons, by the way, that the Protection Board is established in Victoria as an attempt. So as a historian, I've always been interested in, as an Aboriginal person, that one, they weren't secretive at the time. There was an acceptance. There is a wonderful document produced in the New Victorian Colony in 1858, which is the first select committee to look into this violence of Aboriginal people. And what happens is that the new colonial government in Victoria, which has just been established in 1851, it sends out a series of surveys to squatters, landowners, and etc. And they have questions like, what is the current health of the Aboriginal population? What is the current number of the Aboriginal population? And what's remarkable, and one of my old colleagues, David Goodman at Melbourne University, has written about this, so I want to point that out, is that the same men who had been involved in the theft of land a generation earlier and had been directly involved in the killing of Aboriginal people were now sort of part of the landed gentry, wrote back, the Aboriginal people in this district are perfectly quiet. There have never been Aboriginal people in this district. So that's when what I would call that sort of amnesia and the silence and the feigned forgettery, that's when it begins. So it's a narrative that's established after these people become more
Powerful.
civil.
Powerful. Power? Yeah. Sorry to cut you off. It's just that this sparks stuff, and there are probably people here who are feeling quite anxious about what we're talking about. Just if you are, we understand that. We're here talking about exposing denial, and I just want to talk about some of the women's stuff. And I want to talk about, it's not to do with O'Leary, it's Mary Gilmore. And some of you will still have a $10 note in your wallet. Mary Gilmore is on our $10 note. The next time you hand it over to get your coffees, think about this story. In 1935, she published Reminiscences. One of the essays in that reminiscence published in 1935 is called The Whip. It's about Mary Gilmore as a child sitting around the table with her uncle and some other ringers. Her uncle is replatting a stock whip or fixing a stock whip. It's got a fabulous handle, and we all know people who have stock whips that they value. The uncle is sitting there replatting this whip, and the other ringers are making comments about what a fantastic piece of merchandise or infrastructure or whatever you might call it, it was. And he's asked where he got it from. Now, this is a reminiscence. This isn't something that, the black armband people made up. It's a reminiscence by Mary Gilmore, who's on our $10 note. And her uncle starts to tell the story that he was out on his horse and he was looking for a cow and calf that had strayed, and he came across a flock of crows. He also could smell a dead smell. He went towards the dead smell and he found the dead smell emanating from a 10 or 12-year-old girl who was tied with her hands behind her back around a tree and held there by the whip. He took the whip and took it back and was working it up for his own use when his niece made those observations. We don't know whether that child was dead when the crows started to descend. We don't know whether that child was buried by her uncle. What we do know is that no one who was around that table that day went from there to the local police station or wherever else they would have gone to report what had been talked about. Notwithstanding that everybody around that table talked about who the man was that would have in fact done that. And they knew that because he was the person that you had to ride your horse into as he attacked Aboriginal people out on the plain. I think that's a story that Mary Gilmore tells from her own family background that we all need to reflect on. And I just want to reflect on the Benalla story that you're talking about too and going to write on, Stephen, because Euroa is of course just south of Benalla, and we're all very interested in that Benalla incident. And when you look at the work of John Birch, who was the postal delivery person around about that time, he's written quite extensively about what happened around the issue of what's called the Faithful Massacre, which is where the whites got killed. And he refers to a person called Snodgrass. And Snodgrass led the charge on Aboriginal people on the Ovens River Plain after those 8 whites were killed at Benalla. And Burke's narration of it goes like this, that Snodgrass and a bunch of other men, including Colonel White, rode upon Aboriginal people on the plain and riddled them with shot. And when they went into the river, they then shot them as they went into the river, and they shot them before they could come out of the river. That story is not something that is told in the area where I live, and I've had people tell me in Euroa that the reason you don't see Aboriginal people around where we live is because they all went away. So I suppose that's quite sobering. Let me just for a minute talk about O'Leary then, if I can. Can I be indulged to talk about O'Leary?
This is your party.
I don't think it is my party, but let's leap from what happened in the 1800s to 1926, because that's what O'Leary's about. O'Leary's about a man who was a member of a police patrol in 1926 that rode around the Forest River district and killed at least 20 people, at least. O'Leary was a man who concealed his name, who was assisted in concealing his previous involvement in 1922 killings of Aboriginal people in the same area in a royal commission that was held into the 1926 incidents. I've had somebody come to the various places where I've talked about O'Leary and tell me that there is no forensic evidence to support the fact that those people were killed in 1926 in the East Kimberley, because there were no bones found and no teeth found that have been identified as particular people's teeth, although teeth were found. And the reason for that is that after killing all those people, they incinerated their bodies. Standard stuff. And Tony, I'm very sorry that I'm talking about this on a stage with an Aboriginal person, and I'm sorry that that's what's happening, Stephen. But incinerated their bodies. And that was, as I say, modus operandi. It's fascinating, David, to go back to your book, because you talk about one of your relatives as a bullshitter. I talk about O'Leary as a bullshitter. You talk about one of your family members involved in killings as having sat around afterwards and boiled the billy and had dinner. O'Leary did the same. This stuff was routine. It was absolutely routine. But let me just make this observation, and then we'll throw it open to questions or to arm slashing, because that's where you might be at this stage. when that person says to me that there's nothing to support the 1926 massacre of those people, I make this comment. An inspector of police called Douglas was the first policeman to go around the sites in East Kimberley, and he reported 2 months after that incident, or those incidents, and he reported this, that he was taken to one place called Gotta Merry by Suleiman the Tracker, and at Gotta Merry he was of the view that 4 men had been shot and their bodies burnt, and their bodies were burnt in what he described, or somebody described, as an improvised oven, because a hard rock or a large rock was tipped on top of the bodies to make the burning of those bodies more efficient. Inspector Douglas was then taken from that particular part of the Marndock Reserve to a place called Moeri. And it's at Moeri that 3 women were chained around a tree and shot and also incinerated. And teeth were found around the tree to which they were attached. Inspector Douglas was then taken to a third place, and the third place was one where he was confident in his reporting, and I use the word confident advisedly. He was confident that 9 Aboriginal people had been shot and their bodies burnt at the last place at a ravine west of Moeri, and he described that place as having quite clear evidence of timber being dragged from all around to where the bodies were burnt. When Douglas was called to give evidence to the Royal Commission, that particular part of the patrol where 9 people were murdered is barely mentioned. Douglas went on to become the Chief Commissioner of Police in Western Australia sometime later. It's sobering, it's secretive, it's sheltered by our systems, and David, you might want to comment about that because your book talks about it quite extensively, that people who were part of these particular things went on to be the magistrates.
One of the things I discovered when I started properly investigating the native police, and I'd read all the books and I thought I knew everything, and I mean, I'm a huge admirer of Henry Reynolds and the historians who followed him. But what I'd not really understood was that you can't run a death squad for 6 decades, 60 years. You can't run a death squad without careful political structures around it. Not only because it was constantly being denounced by good citizens, but because you needed to protect the death squad from the law. There was never a law that actually allowed the native police to do what they were ordered to do, which was to go out into the bush and kill, on suspicion, Aboriginal people. There was code, of course. Disperse was the principal code, but the officers themselves were willing to tell official inquiries that disperse meant just to fire into them. There was a wonderful squatter somewhere in the north of Queensland who wrote to the Attorney-General and then published his letter when he got no reply, suggesting they might use birdshot instead of bullets when dispersing the blacks, because in that way they wouldn't be killed, they would just be peppered and not killed, and therefore fewer murders would occur. That didn't interest the Queensland authorities because the murders were what they actually wanted. There was no law to justify any of this. So a magistrate might get panicky and start saying, but look, you've got no legal basis on which to do this. So what the Queensland government did in order to guard against this was to promote the more respectable officers to the bench. So my great-great-grandfather, after half a dozen years of killing and becoming a complete drunk, which was the usual fate of the officers of the native police, they went in sober and they came out drunks. And he was put on the bench, and he was posted all around Queensland as a man who knew how the system worked. And you didn't listen to, some kind of city lawyer who might go out there and say, yes, but where is the justification in law for what you've done? And the system had to be guarded, it had to be financed, and we've mentioned inquiries into what the police did. One of the most inquired into issues in the colonies up to about the 1870s was the fate of the Aboriginal people and the work of the native police. And none of those inquiries did the Aboriginal people any good at all. In fact, I argue in my book that each made the position of the Indigenous worse, because the inquiry would ventilate horrible things that had happened, and then no punishments would be imposed. And therefore, the government was signalling to the squatters that they could continue doing this or worse. The bar was never raised. In all those years, it just kept going down. And you had therefore a paramilitary killing squad that survived for 60 years in Queensland. Scholars have been doing a lot of I call it careful guesswork, about the number of Indigenous that the native police killed. And certainly the consensus of those scholars is now that it was upwards of 40,000 people and probably upwards of 60,000 people. Now, 60,000 is the magic number, of course, because that's the number of Australians killed in the Great War, 60,000. So this was an efficient, long-lasting, brutal, lawless paramilitary squad, protected, financed and directed by the Queensland government.
And they were a bit of a club. One of the things that really exercised me about O'Leary was after 1926, the next massacre of Aboriginal people was in 1928 in a place or around a place called Coniston, which is near Tennant Creek, and that was actually perpetrated under the authority of Constable Murray, who had been a member of the 10th Light Horse. And O'Leary, after 1926, went to Tennant Creek, where he was involved in some mining enterprises, rather suspiciously, but anyway, mining enterprises. And what I found when I went back over Trove, don't we love Trove?
We adore
We
Trove.
love Trove.
Trove
Please
is
use
opening our
Trove.
past to us.
When I went back looking for photographs, because of course you will find photographs, I found a photograph of O'Leary standing next to the Catholic priest who was the person who had the diocese for Tennant Creek, both of them very happy in each other's company. I also found a photograph which had been taken by Constable Rea in 1922 of the 1922 mass killings in the East Kimberley, the one that Aboriginal people said left the country to stink all around, their words. And I found that photo and thought that's an interesting one. And then suddenly I found myself looking at Constable Murray being lionised by Ernestine Hill in some journalese. Ernestine Hill's lionisation of him used a photograph, and the photograph that she used was actually of Constable Rea's photo of the Anir patrol in 1922 in the Kimberley, nothing to do with Murray. And the only person who could have actually given Murray that particular photograph, who then gave it to Ernestine Hill, in my view, was O'Leary. But we do know that O'Leary, when he was in Tennant Creek, was in fact involved with Murray for another reason, because they were both involved in a murder trial where the white person was discharged on a charge of killing another white person. But they were a club. Tony, I could see you thinking. I could see both you and Stephen thinking. Is there anything you'd like to say in reflection? And if there's any questions from anybody, please
We've been thinking.
stick your hand up.
Well, the only thing I've been thinking a lot of things, but one of them, just very quickly, is we also have to recognise what I would say is the evolution of this criminal behaviour, and you can find a direct link with the behaviour of these institutions, with institutional detainment of Aboriginal people moving on into the 20th century, into the stolen generations. And I say that quite specifically because the first institutionalisation of Aboriginal children in Victoria occurs at Corranderk in 1865, and that sets up what happens in the 20th century. The level of criminality, though, the association is explicit. I don't know if anyone has seen of recent weeks, and maybe over a couple of months now, the expose in the Guardian newspaper of the Aboriginal men who had been children incarcerated at Kempsey Boys' Home, which was a notorious institution where Aboriginal boys were sent after being removed from their family. Just two things that come out of that is now an attempt to try and recover the common graves, or the graves of Aboriginal children who died there, some of whom were most likely murdered. But to go to that sort of the continuity of people involved in these crimes, this is again very public knowledge. The manager of Kempsey Boys Home in the 1930s was charged with crimes of violence against boys. He was regarded by the Crown itself talked about as a very sadistic man who'd physically assaulted boys, most likely sexually assaulted boys, and he was removed from that post. A little while later, he props up where he gets a job as the manager of Cumragunja Aboriginal Reserve on the Murray, Victoria and New South Wales Murray River. You have these men who are part of that industry, so rather than him being convicted and in prison, he gets a new posting. That, by the way, is why the so-called very famous Cumragunja walk-off occurred, that the Aboriginal people of Cumragunja, after his appointment and knowing his history, simply refused to stay there and moved across the river to the Victorian side of the river. So I think these histories have an incredible genealogy, whether it be through families, particular institutions, the Freemasons. And I'm not going to one of those deep conspiracies here. I used to be in the fire brigade and we were run by the Freemasons, I can assure you. That's another story. I was in a subversive group called the Catholic 11, but but you do get the continuity of these behaviours, and governments burying these crimes by, as we know, with the abuse of children in institutions, be it the Catholic Church, that we know about priests who were moved on to other parishes, etc. There's a long history of these men who committed these crimes of simply being moved to other locations where they continue to behave in the same way.
And going to your point, Stephen, because you make the point that a massacre also needs to be seen in terms of people's resistance. There's an awful lot of work that's been done over fairly recent times about subaltern studies and about Aboriginal people and other Indigenous people surveilling those who surveilled them. And the Cumragunja story is a fascinating one, because the people that I know from Cumragunja are the people who will tell that story and say, we knew what was happening in Kempsey and we didn't know it because any white person told us. So does that speak to you about your observations about resistance and about Aboriginal people being in control of some of this?
Absolutely.
To the extent they could be?
Yeah, one of the one of the things I'm looking at the moment is the extent of Aboriginal knowledge of what was going on hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometres away from, where people lived. So the Bathurst War in 1824 was obviously communicated to Wiradjuri down south and Murrumbidgee and the Murray, and you can see in the responses how that communication occurred. So those messages were being sent, those stories were being told every year at gatherings right across the country. And that's one of the things I'm looking at, is how that affected the coordination of resistance, which historically historians have not seen it as a thing. Resistance was scattered. It was guerrilla warfare here and there, and it wasn't coordinated. It's actually, when you look into the detail and start to scratch below the surface, very coordinated and in moments incredibly effective, where you've got the Battle of Miwa, One Tree Hill, where Aboriginal people build a kind of fence to trap drays, ambush them, and then beat back an armed party, mounted armed party of squatters and stockmen, and win an amazing victory with stockpiled weapons, and so I can go on about those kinds of victories. But just to flip back to what both you guys were saying, I think that the secret of the bush, the bush silence, is incredibly important, but I often get surprised by the brazenness of some of the, particularly in the 1820s and 30s, before 1838, of people. I was looking at a letter in 1833 to the Herald where a squatter names the other squatter and says exactly what he did and it's published in the Herald. Now, nothing happens to that squatter. All the details are there. And I think partly at that point it's about there's a lack of colonial authority and control beyond the 19 counties. But also the other thing it goes with is the fact that stockmen, convicts, ex-convicts, could shoot Aboriginal people on site for killing a cow. It's just every conflict I look at. A stockman goes out on his horse with his gun and dog and sees an Aboriginal person roasting a bullock and shoots them as if he has this God-given right to do that. And I think in particular of Charles Booth, who did exactly that in Bathurst. He was a convict at the time, gets rewarded, gets a land grant, and now is regarded in local histories as the founder of Millthorpe, the first settler in Millthorpe. But he was a murderer, rewarded for it. And the other thing I just want to touch on was often these people I find, they go quiet in the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s, but by the 1880s, they are actually proud and reminiscing of what they did. They don't give the details. That really pisses me off. They say, you know, we went out and we hunted down the blacks and we shot, you know, lots of people and then there was peace forever after in the district, and I was part of that.
It's fascinating where these people are, and we might finish with a word from you about the journalist, David, but before we do that, that person Snodgrass who led that charge in Benalla went on to be in the Melbourne Legislative Assembly, the Melbourne Legislative Council, and in fact he was the person who was responsible for removing from the Akron Aboriginal people the land grant that they had given to them in 1851, and he gave it to a bloke called Jones, who is a person who is featured constantly in your narrative, and I wonder if they're connected.
It's not that Jones. I mean, when you're researching the life...
What a pity.
When you're researching the life of a man called Richard Jones, you just discover how many Richard Joneses there were in the colony. There was an actor, there was a former convict, and then there was the splendid editor of the Maitland Mercury, all called Richard Jones. I'm so fascinated by the late life memoirs, where which we have to be very careful of, because there was an awful lot of bullshit in them about the brave things I did and the things I faced. One of the this was a land of newspapers. There was a wonderful description I only discovered the other day. A 19th century visitor to Australia described Australia as the land of newspapers, because every little town had a newspaper. And they recorded so much, and Trove is opening us to all of that. And so much was known then, and so much can be known to us now through those newspapers. And of all of the voices throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century that were deploring what was happening to the Aboriginal people, there were a few churchmen, not the Church of England. Later on, some Catholics, but they were afraid. They were very afraid of rocking the boat. The churchmen were Congregationalists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and one or two Quakers. But the best, and there were wonderful squatters who defended the Aboriginal people, and there were a few wonderful magistrates who defended the Aboriginal people, but the people who come out of the 19th century best are journalists. Editors, writers and journalists. They were the most persistent, the clearest and the loudest voices deploring what was going on, and their accounts remain hugely valuable today. So in this extraordinary crime story that we're investigating, we're still discovering what was done, we're still discovering why nothing happened, and the only thing that we can do from all of this is just make sure the truth is now clear. That's all we can do.
Thank you, David. And we've got the wind up from the back there, and none of you have got to ask a question, and that makes me a lousy panel chair. But I'm fairly confident that whatever you take away from here, it won't be anything about the panel chair. It'll be about how, looking at what we've just been through in our country, we need to be thinking about truth-telling, and this is one of the places to start. Thank you to the panel.